Hi, class. What I wanted to do is a quick little overview of why you would want to use a clay shader or a gray shader. Now, when you're taking your models and you're going to be putting a portfolio together to show your models, you're going to want to be showing your models all textured, which is really nice, and we want to stage it that way, and that's the way that we would first want to see somebody's model. So you're going to take your model and you're going to render it out really nice with textures and such, and like I think I've said in other videos where I've kind of shown this particular piece, this is procedural textures. So this is custom shaders. Procedural textures is how this is done. There's no bitmaps on this with the exception of this logo right here is a bitmap. This is all done with procedural textures. And this is a great model to show somebody. But somebody that's in the industry that's wanting to hire you, they want to know more than this, okay? So what they also want to know is your ability to sculpt, okay? So what they want to do is to be able to see your model in it with a gray shader on it. When they see it with a gray shader, then we're seeing the actual sculpt that you've done, the quality of how you've actually built what you've built, not fettered with textures on it. So this is why we do gray shaders, or they're referred to also as clay shaders. I've never heard them called mud shaders before, but I guess some people call them that. But I've heard it clay shaders. Now, a clay shader really denotes that we're not putting highlights on them. And I kind of encourage my students to not do a straight clay shader, but just a gray shader. So we actually put highlights on it so it seems more of a volume. So I wanted to go through here and kind of show you how to do that the way that I do it, which is not necessarily the right way to do it. It's just the way I do it. Here's another example. You can see that when you show your gray shader this way, or your model with your gray shader, you can see all the little details which start getting lost when you put textures in it. So this surely shows a particular client, the quality of the modeling that you do. Now, another thing we do besides clay shaders is we also do wireframes. They want to see the underlying structure of what you actually sculpted. So these are built subdivision surfaces, and that's why, your polys are down low, but what's what we want to see. And I see a mistake that I see students do all the time in which they want to show me a wireframe with the subdivisions on it. That's really kind of stupid, because what I want to see as the potential employer is how you sculpted it. When you put a subdivision on it, then you're not showing me your actual wireframe. You're showing me a bastardization of your wireframe. So your wireframe should be exactly what you sculpted. And then your gray shader, that's where you have your subdivision to show off the beauty of your actual modeling skills that you did. Okay, so let's go in here and look at a couple of things. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to show you this particular piece right here. What this is a piece that my students do as a test in my basic 3D modeling class. This is a 6 weeks test that they have in that class. So we do this on week 5, and they have a 4-hour class to build and texture and light this model. But I wanted to use it as the basis to kind of show you clay shaders and how that I have people approach it. Okay, so here's the model in Max. And I just want to go in and talk about really the materials that we're using on here. Okay, one of the first things that I'm doing in my particular one here is a little unique thing that I do that really doesn't have much to do with clay shaders, but I just thought I'd show it to you while I'm in here, is how I set up my cyc wall. So let's just pick the cyc wall in here and hide everything else. And so I've got this cyc wall, okay, and it's just a curved wall. When I'm doing my shaders on that, one of the things that I want the area around the model to be reflective, but I don't want the background to be reflective, okay? So that way, because if you have the background reflective, then as you're placing your lights in here, you get hot spots and stuff back there. And I really don't want that. So I want the area in here to be reflective, but not back there. So I build a custom shader for that. Basically, what I'm doing here is coming in and pulling in from the standard, I'm pulling in a blend. Okay, a blend allows me to blend between two shaders, okay, with a mask in between them. So I pull that out there, and then I replace these standard shaders with Arch and Design shaders. Okay, so we're using the blend node, and I've replaced our two standard shaders with Arch and Design shaders. This particular one, which is in the top slot, is my reflective shader. So I'm setting reflectivity and how I want it in this one. This shader is more of a clay kind of shader in which there are no reflection on it, and it's put in the second slot. The way the blend works is when you're creating a mask, and I have a mask here, and I'll show you how I created this. Whatever's in the top slot, wherever this is black, will show the top slot, and wherever it's white will show the bottom slot. Okay. Now, how I created this little ramp is I just went into Max, and I came in here, and I pulled out a gradient ramp. Okay. And the way a gradient ramp works is you have a gradient in here. And really, for what I'm doing is I don't need this middle tag, so I'm just going to delete that. What I need is two tags on each end, and I need these to be black. Okay, so the way you can do, there's a couple of ways. This one's already set to black. I can right-click, copy this, and then click on this one and paste it, and that'll paste that black in there. Or another way to do it is I need this one to be white. I can double-click on it, and that'll bring up your color picker, and then you can set it to whatever color. So I need this to be white. The reason I do that is I want to be able to control an area that's solid black, and I want to be able to control an area that's solid white. Wherever this is solid black, this shader will show up, and wherever this is solid white, this shader will show up, and the gradient in between will fall off between the two shaders. Okay. Then the next thing I need to do is I need this to be round. So right here in your gradient type, you can come in here and make this radial, and then it will be a radial ramp. Okay. So that's how I make the radial ramp. Now, you have to be able to kind of see in your viewport the gradient when you want it on your object. The Arch and Design shaders are kind of sluggish in doing that, so I use a standard shader. I tell you guys never to use a standard shader, so I guess I lied to you. There are times that I do use a standard shader just for a second. I'm just going to use this as a proxy. So I'm going to put this diffuse in it, and then I'm going to pick my ground, and I'm going to apply this to it. Okay, let's just realign these real quick so I can see both of them at the same time. And then I'm going to assign this to it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on being able to see it in the viewport. Okay, so now since I click this button, I can see this on the viewport. This works really well with the standard shader. I don't know if it's just my display card because I don't have a really high-end display card, but it doesn't work too well if you're putting it on these shaders. So I just do this as a proxy for a short period of time where I can see how to adjust this to get it the way I want. So basically what's happening is every place this is black, this shader, this reflective shader is going to show up, and every place that it's white, this shader, the dull shader, is going to show up. Okay, so we can go to our camera view, and you can see reflection in here, no reflection in there, and that's what's going to happen. Okay, so then once I get finished with that, then I don't need this node anymore. I can just delete it, and then I reapply this back to my wall, and then when it renders, that's what will happen. Now, the other thing I want to show you is the actual shader that I make on my objects for the clay rendering, okay? Basically, how I do that is I do the same thing. I'm going to show a blend in here, okay, and then I'm going to replace these two. Actually, I'm just going to replace the top one. I'm going to leave the standard in the bottom one, and I'm going to put an Arch and Design in the top one, okay. And matter of fact, I'm sorry, not a blend, shellac. I'm sorry, not a blend, a shellac. So we're going to replace the top one in the shellac, and we're going to put our Arch and Design. So this is the way this shellac is different than the blend. It works differently. You'll notice it doesn't have a mask, okay? And this is the way that this node works. Whatever's in the top slot will actually pass through and be on your object. And then you're writing on your second slot, you're doing a percentage of putting this one on it. But here's a trick about this shellac. If this shader, this bottom one, is black, the shader becomes transparent and you can't see it. Okay, so we're going to double click on here so we can kind of watch this. So I'm going to come in there and make this at 100%. Okay. So when this is a color, let's change it to a color again. You can see it's blending this into it. It's like blending this shader right on top of it. But it does a strange thing. When you make this black, then the shader becomes transparent. Now, what this is going to allow me to do is to control how much reflection and how much highlight is showing on my object. Okay, so right now, I'm going to turn this down a little bit. I want a little bit of reflection and some highlight on my object. Okay, but I don't want too much reflection in here. Okay. So I don't want too much reflection on a gray shader because it kind of masks the quality of the rendering. Now, what I'm going to do on this one, since I have this set at 100%, I am actually making this one 100% going on top of here. But when I have this as black, the only thing that will show up is the specular highlight. So as I start kicking up this specular highlight, it starts showing up on here. So now I'm able to control two different kinds of highlights on here. You know, I told you guys this was a stupid shader. Well, sometimes it's nice to have a stupid shader because I can manipulate it. Oh, I'm a manipulator. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to narrow this down a little bit. And so now I can control a secondary highlight on the surface. So as I'm rendering, I can adjust more of a spread of a highlight across my surface to really show my surface the way I want it. And so that's a huge advantage. So the shellac node is really good for that. And this is kind of a little trick that I do with the standard shader to be able to control the fall off of a highlight on my object. Okay, so here is our rendering of this, and so I'm going to take you through how I ended up coming with my clay shader. So this is the initial render. Okay, here's the reference that I give the students that they start from. This was done from a specific site that I got it, and the students kind of replicate that. Here's my lighting. So you can see up here, I'm using a skylight that gives me bounce lighting. I'm using a photometric light, free light that's down. This gives me top lighting. Then I have two more photometrics. The one on the left gives me a cool lighting, and the one on the right gives me a warm lighting. So let me take you through this. Okay, so here is the skylight. Okay, so in this particular piece, all I have is the skylight in here, and all I'm really doing is wanting it to do bounce lighting in here to give me some soft shadows and soft lighting. Now, one of the things I do with this is I render everything in separate passes. So I render each one of my lights separately, and then I go back and composite them together because then I have more control over exactly how I want to mix this stuff together. So when I'm doing that, I initially get the lights exactly the way I want them using everything. Then when I start rendering them separately, I crank them up. So I normally start with an exposure control of a +4. Then when I get ready to render these one by one, I step it down one to a +3, which opens up the aperture a little bit, which makes them a little bit brighter. So when I render them, I want them a little bit brighter than what I really want them in the end, which allows me, when I'm in Photoshop and I'm compositing them together, that I can pull them down a little bit. You can't really push your shading up. You can only pull it down. Okay, if I don't render it bright enough and then I try to use my levels to kick it up hotter, then it adds grain into it, and we don't want to do that. So, well, before I render these in separate passes, I render them a step hotter than I want, which is just easy to go into your exposure control, set it down one setting, and then all your lights will be a little bit hotter. Okay, so first step that I do is I starting to render these clay shaders. I've already done my shaders on here. I've already set up my reflectivity and everything on my cyc wall, and I've already set up my lights, and I adjust them till I get it just the way I want it. Now I'm turning all the lights off, and I'm only rendering with each light individually. First one I'm showing you here, I render with the skylight. The skylight is a standard light. Basically what it does is just bounce lights around. It's non-directional. Doesn't really matter where this particular light is sitting in the scene because his light's not coming from it. What it does is basically it creates a dome around your scene, and then it has light come from that whole dome, and so you get this nice soft lighting. Okay, then the next thing I do is now I've turned on my light from the top. So this is my down lighting. This is a free light. Okay, it's a free light. It's a photometric light. and it's pointing straight down, and then I've got it set to a rectangle, and then I'm setting the rectangle to a certain size to get the light I want. So this is getting me my down lighting. Okay, so go back. There's my bounce lighting. Here's my lighting coming from straight down. Okay, the next light we're going to have is a light coming from the left. So we're turning the left light on. Okay, so this is a photometric that's coming back. By the way, this is a top-down view from the front, from the right. Hopefully you can kind of see it. And I've got it set to disk. This can be set to rectangle. I'm just setting it to disk. So what's happening is light is not coming from the point. Light's coming from the entire disk. I also have increased the Kelvin rating on this. I think I have this one at, I think it's 7,500. My default lighting of white is 6,500. 6,500 will get you basically a white light. This is set to about 7,500 to 7,800, which pushes it into a blue range. Because what I really want to do is a neutral light of white coming from the top, and I'm going to use kind of a cool light coming from the left and a warm light coming from the right. Okay, and that's cool and warm as in temperature. Okay, so there's my light from the top. Then here's the light coming from the side. And now we're going to add in this light to the right. There's my warm light coming in. This light is a little bit lower in the horizon. And so cool light from the left, warm light from the top. And then there is your light coming from the top. Okay, so cool from the left, top. Warm from the right bottom. Now, this can be done. You don't have to follow this exactly. This is just the way I do it. Okay, and so now here are all of these actually put together and composited in Photoshop. Okay, so this is my final composite. Now, this is what it looked like when I rendered it out of Max. Okay, so this is all three of your lights rendered together out of Max. This is what it looked like when I got finished compositing it. So I have more control to get exactly what I want on it by rendering them as separate passes and then bringing them back into Photoshop. Or if we're doing an animation, you can bring these back into Nuke or After Effects and composite them together if it's an animation. I just do a Photoshop because it's a still shot. Okay, so there's directly out of Max. Okay, now the other thing that I do is some post-processing. I render an AO pass. Okay, this is an ambient occlusion pass. And I'm using an AO shader, and this is set what I call an AO wide. When you first come in and set up an AO pass, this max distance is set to 0. And I see people, and you'll see a lot of people doing this out in the internet. Oh my God, there's so much information that you can get out on the internet and YouTube, get all this information, and there's a lot of really bad information out there. I see people showing you how to do an AO, and those people don't know what the hell they're talking about. They leave this as 0, which puts basically when this is at 0, it means infinity. So it calculates your occlusion all the way across to infinity, and what you have is a gray shader, which is basically what I call a dirt shader. This should actually, and I've got this set because this is physically measured right. This thing is about, I don't know, it's about 1.5 feet wide, I think is how big this object is. So I've got 6 inches. So it's actually calculating out about 6 inches for the occlusion. Occlusion is where two objects go together to create this shading. Okay. Then I do what's called an AO tight. I render it again, but I change some of the settings and I break this down, and this is comes out about 1/2 inch. And then I lower the spread. The spread is the gradient of how far the edge of it will calculate. And what I'm trying to do is just get these really tiny crevices for an AO tight. Because what happens is when I use my AO white, it's got these crevices in here, but I'm only going to use this at about a 70% on top, and so these will bleach out a little bit. So I come back in with this AO tight and lay it back on top of it, and then I'll blend it in with maybe about a 30%, and it boosts it back on top of there. Now another thing that I do is I also come in and render a mask. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm actually using a standard shader because I find a standard shader is actually easier and better for doing this. So I take a standard shader and then I make it white. And then the trick here is I make it 100% self-illuminated. When I make it 100% self-illuminated, then it means it cannot cast or receive shadows. So then I hide the background because otherwise the background would be white too because I'm using the switcher just like not the switcher, but the override, material override. And so it will put it on here, and then I can render it. And what I'm looking for is a stark white, black and white image that I can use as a mask. Okay. All right. Then I take these back into Photoshop. Now here's my composite that I did in Photoshop without them on it. And so I'm going to one by one add these on and so you can see what how they added to it. So now I'm going to add in the AO wide. So when I go back and forth, you can see subtle differences as I'm laying in this AO wide. Little subtle differences, but they're helping lock the image back correctly. And then I'm going to come back in and put our AO tight on it. Okay, look right in here. You'll see that this AO tight is giving me a little bit more in here. So there's my composite. There's with the AO wide. There's with the AO tight. Then the next thing I did is I used the mask and I masked out the background and I adjusted the value, the darkness and the saturation of the background separately. So here you can see the background getting a little bit darker, and that's where I'm using this mask to adjust it. And then there's my final piece. Okay. So to go back over that, what we have is our skylight with bounce light, our free light, it's a photometric light coming straight down, then another photometric target light coming in from the left with blue lighting, another photometric coming in from the right with warm lighting. Then we've got two AO passes. We got an AO wide and then an AO tight, and then we've got a mask, and then composite all together to get my final clay shot that I would put in the portfolio. Okay, and then we can compare it to a Max render. So that's the rendering out of Max that you would get directly out of Max, and there's my final piece. Max, my final composite. Max, my final composite. Okay. Now, these techniques that I'm doing, I do the same thing whether I'm doing a clay shader or I'm actually doing it on the final shaders also. So this has the AO passes and all the exact same things on it as well. Okay, then the last thing I want to show you is how to do those AO passes that I talked about. Okay, to do an AO pass, you initially going to need a mental ray shader. Okay, so people get confused with this. They'll try to do it with a standard shader. They'll try to do it with an Arch and Design shader. It can only work with a mental ray shader. And I don't mean any mental ray shader. I mean the mental ray shader. Okay, so basically you pull out a mental ray shader, and then in your surface slot, you're going to pull out and you'll go to mental ray, and then you want to click on an ambient reflective occlusion. Okay. I will end up making this an AO wide. Okay. And then I set my AO settings for a wide. So this will be according to the size of my object, but everything's measured correctly. So in my case, so what I did for that piece we were just looking at is I did 6 inches. I wanted this to calculate out 6 inches. Okay. The only things you'll normally change are the maximum distance. That's how far out it's actually going to calculate the bounce of the light. The spread is the gradient of the edge of the shadow. So the bigger this is, the bigger the gradient. So when I'm doing my tight, I change these back down. Okay, I want them back down. But for wide, I leave it up there. Now, this samples is the quality. This will be kind of grainy. So when you're doing your test renders, I'll leave it at 16, but I'll kick it up to something like 64 most of the times when I do my final render, so it's a nice smooth render. Then I'll take this AO wide and hold down my shift key, and I'll make a copy of it. And I go down here and I make this an AO tight. And then, so your AO wide is set up this way, AO tight, and I want it to be smaller, so I don't want it to go 6 inches out on this particular one. Like I said, yours are different according to what you're doing. I want this to be about a ½ an inch out. And then I want the spread to be tighter because I'm doing those little crevices, so I have this around 3. And so I'll set both of these up. Now, I'll show you the way I set up my shader tree. It's kind of complex, but I'll kind of show you the way I set it up, okay? What I do is I come in here, and I'm going to pull in a mix map. Okay, and I'm going to put that in here. Okay, and then I'm going to plug this into slot 1 and this into slot 2. Okay, and this is my AO mix. So this is actually, I'm going to be using this as a switcher. So what's going on now is I have both of these put in here, and now when this is set at 0, when this switcher is set to 0, this shader is showing up, the top shader, black. When it's set to 100, then this shader is set up, okay? Now, the reason I do that is because I'm going to put this into a specific slot, and I want to be able to make it easy for me to switch in and out without having to physically switch these, so it's an easy way to do it. Now, on that mask, what I'm doing with that is I bring in a standard shader, and then I set it to white, and then I set this as 100% self-illuminated, and so this is my mask node, and this will create a mask. Now, one thing to remember is that when you're doing a mask, okay, or you're doing an AO pass, you have to turn off your exposure control. These are not true shaders in the sense that they need an exposure control, and it will actually, you'll get really weird settings when you leave the exposure control on. So you have to turn the exposure control off, render these, and then remember to turn it back on for your normal lighting. Now, the other thing that I do right here is, this is my AOs. Okay, then I come out in here with a blend, and I delete these two nodes. This is in the top slot. This is in the bottom slot. Okay, and this is my processing shader. And so now the same thing is going on here, in which that if I want to render a mask, right now when this is set at 0, the top one is going through, so it's an AO pass. But when I get ready to render my mask, then I change this to 100, and now we're rendering this node, okay? Okay, where does this go? Okay, this is where you put this, okay? This only works with Mental Ray. So if you go to Rendering, Render Setup, you have a Processing tab right here. With this Processing tab, you have an area that's called Material Override. And you enable this, and then you drop this into this slot as an instance. We talked about that as an instance. When this is on, then it turns off every shader that's in your scene, turns off all your lights, and the only thing that's going to be seen is this material. So it's a temporary way to be able to drop this into your scene, okay? The other thing you got to make sure that you do, though, is you have to come in here to Exposure Control. Now, you don't want to turn this completely off because you've already got settings in here for your scene. All you want to do is uncheck it here to be active. So that temporarily turns this off. So when we're rendering our AO pass, that we're getting a nice ambient occlusion and our exposure is not altering it. When we get finished with this and we've done our AO2 AO passes and we've rendered our mask, then we just uncheck this and we turn this back on, and now we're right back to with all of our materials back on our object, and we're back to our normal rendering setup. Okay, and that's how I do those passes. So hopefully this will give you some information to make you understand kind of how to stage your stuff, how to use gray shaders, a clay shader, and get nice renders to be able to show your models as best as possible for your portfolio. Okay, thank you very much.